The sound of my grandfather's 100-year-old pine door exploding off its hinges was the only thing that interrupted the Attorney General. One moment, she was taking a sip of coffee, explaining the intricacies of state racketeering statutes, and the next, we were staring at a gaping hole where my front door used to be. Wood splintered across the floor like shrapnel. Through the dust and morning light stood Brenda Walsh, HOA president, her face a mask of manicured rage, her phone held high and recording. She was live streaming. Of course she was. She had weaponized social media for months, and now she was bringing her digital mob to my front door for the grand finale. She just had no idea what that finale was actually going to be. Her voice, a weaponized shriek designed to curdle blood and win arguments through sheer volume, cut through the sudden silence. This is an unauthorized meeting on HOA property. I am the governing authority here, and I demand to know what is going on. My guest, Attorney General Catherine Royce, the woman who had successfully prosecuted 2 governors and dismantled the largest public corruption ring in the state's history, slowly placed her coffee mug down on a stack of my evidence binders. She didn't flinch. She didn't even look surprised. She just looked interested. Like a biologist who had just witnessed a rare and incredibly stupid predator walk directly into a trap. Brenda, wrapped in $1,000 worth of yoga pants and self-importance, took another step inside, her expensive running shoes crunching on the debris of my doorway. I have this all on camera. State officials colluding with a known community violator. This is harassment. This is a conspiracy. She was spitting the words out, a perfectly rehearsed tirade for her online audience. The comment section was probably exploding with outrage from people who thought they were watching a brave citizen journalist stand up to the deep state. What they were actually watching was a woman committing multiple felonies on video. I did a quick tally in my head. Criminal trespass, that was 1. Breaking and entering, that's 2. Malicious destruction of property, 3. Intimidation of a public official, a particularly nasty one, that's 4. And since she was broadcasting it across state lines using the internet, she'd just gift-wrapped a federal charge of interstate communication of a threat for the FBI. She had no clue. 0. She saw a retired old man in a fishing cabin. She didn't see a man who'd spent 30 years as a forensic accountant for the Department of Justice, a man whose entire professional life consisted of sending entitled criminals exactly like her to federal prison. She was so blinded by her own petty authority, so convinced of her own narrative, that she couldn't see the reality of the situation. She was a gnat flying into the engine of a 747. "Ma'am, I suggest you lower your voice in your camera," the Attorney General said, her tone as calm and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. Brenda just laughed, a high, piercing sound. "You have no authority here. This is Clearwater Lake Estates. I am the authority." The delusion was breathtaking. She was standing in my living room, which predated her HOA by 70 years, screaming about her jurisdiction over a state attorney general. Her eyes were wild, darting between me and Catherine Royce, convinced she was cornering us. She was about to learn, on camera, that she hadn't just stormed a retired man's cabin. She had walked into the final audit of her entire criminal life, her entire fraudulent empire, the kickback schemes, the shell companies, the intimidation, the systematic theft from her neighbors. It was all detailed in the binders sitting on the table right next to the Attorney General's coffee. The meeting she had just gate-crashed wasn't a conspiracy against her. It was the final prosecutorial review before the state unsealed her indictment. But 6 months ago, I would have found this scene impossible to believe. 6 months ago, I thought Brenda Walsh was just another neighborhood nuisance, a power-drunk HOA Karen with too much time on her hands. I had no idea I was sitting on the one piece of land that could not only unravel her multi-million-dollar fraud, but expose a decade of carefully concealed political corruption that went all the way to the county commissioner's office. I thought I had retired to a quiet life of fishing and solitude. I had no idea I was about to be dragged into one last case. Brenda took another swaggering step forward, shoving her phone toward the Attorney General's face. "The people have a right to know who you are and what you're doing in my community," she screeched. Attorney General Royce slowly reached into her jacket, and for a second, I think Brenda thought she was reaching for a weapon. Instead, she pulled out her official badge. "I'm Catherine Royce," she said, her voice dropping to an icy calm. "I'm the Attorney General of this state, and you, Mrs. Walsh, are under arrest. To understand how a state attorney general ended up in my living room watching a woman self-destruct on a live stream, you have to go back 6 months. Back to a time when my life was quiet. That quiet was something I had earned. My name is Frank Miller. I'm 58 years old, and for 30 of those years I worked as a forensic accountant for the Department of Justice. It's not a job you see in movies. There are no car chases, no shootouts. There's just you, a mountain of discovery documents, and the quiet, methodical work of untangling the lies that criminals tell with money. My job was simple. I followed the numbers. I tracked stolen funds through mazes of shell companies. I identified fake invoices, and I built the ironclad financial cases that allowed federal prosecutors to put men who thought they were untouchable behind bars for a very long time. I worked on everything from mafia run, construction scams in Chicago to multi-billion-dollar corporate fraud cases on Wall Street. The work was demanding, and it taught me one fundamental truth. Criminals, no matter how smart they think they are, always get arrogant. They always leave a trail, and I was the man the government paid to walk that trail to its inevitable conclusion. When I retired, I left that world behind completely. I didn't want a condo in Florida or a golf course membership. I wanted the one thing I hadn't had in 30 years: silence. And the only place I could find it was at my grandfather's cabin on Clearwater Lake. He built it with his own hands back in the 50s, a solid fortress of hand-hewn logs and river stone, nestled on 2 acres of untouchable shoreline. This wasn't just a piece of property to me. It was a legacy. My grandfather, Thomas Miller, wasn't just a builder. He was one of the original state surveyors who mapped this entire county. He understood land, and he understood the law. And when he bought this plot from the state in 1954, he negotiated a deed that was a masterpiece of legal foresight. Because our land bordered the new Clearwater State Preserve, he worked with the state to place it under a unique state conservation easement. On paper, it's a dense legal document full of clauses and subsections. But what it meant was simple and powerful. My property answered to the state of 100, not to any local municipality or future neighborhood association. It was protected land. Furthermore, the deed granted our property primary riparian rights, extending 50 feet out from the shoreline. In plain English, it meant that my dock, my boat, and my stretch of the lake were legally part of my private property, established decades before the first luxury home was ever built here. My grandfather wasn't just building a cabin. He was building a fortress, not of wood and stone, but of legal precedent. He used to say, "Frank, they can't take what the law says is yours." I never realized those words, and the protections he embedded in that deed would one day become the legal sledgehammer I needed to crush a criminal conspiracy. For the first few months of my retirement, it was heaven. I'd spend my days fishing off that same dock he built, restoring the old stonework of the fireplace, and enjoying the simple peace of the lake. My neighbors were mostly folks who'd been here for decades, people who remembered my grandfather. My closest neighbor, Eleanor Gable, a retired history teacher in her 80s, would bring me fresh-baked bread once a week. She'd known my family for 50 years. "Your grandfather was a good man, Frank," she told me one afternoon on my porch. Quiet, but you always knew he saw everything. You're cut from the same cloth. She was right. I've never been a loud man. I don't make threats. I don't get into shouting matches. In my line of work, the loudest person in the room is usually the one with the weakest case. My strength was in observation, in the quiet collection of facts until the weight of the evidence became so overwhelming that my target's entire world simply collapsed. Mrs. Gable saw that in me. "People around here think you're just a quiet retiree," she'd said, a knowing look in her eye. "They don't understand. You're not the type to get mad. You're the type to get evidence." She had no idea how prophetic those words would be. I had my fortress of legal precedent, a lifetime of professional experience in dismantling fraud, and the quiet life I had always wanted. I was ready for a peaceful retirement. What I wasn't ready for was the day that pure, unfiltered greed rolled into our community in a pearl-white Escalade with vanity plates that read HOALAW. Brenda Walsh saw me as a quiet, old man living in an old cabin. She never once thought to ask what I did for a living before I retired. She saw a target. What she didn't see was the one man on the entire lake who was uniquely, professionally, and legally equipped to not just fight her, but to utterly destroy her. The first shot in that war came in the form of a certified letter, an attack not on me, but on the one thing she should have never, ever touched: my grandfather's legacy. Brenda Walsh arrived in our community like an invasive species. She and her husband Dan bought one of the new, oversized McMansions on the far side of the lake. Within 6 months, through a campaign of aggressive politicking and backroom promises, she had seized control of the Homeownerassociation. Before her, the HOA was a sleepy, informal committee that mostly planned the annual 4th of July barbecue. Under Brenda's rule, it transformed into a weaponized authority with her as its supreme commander. Her husband, County Commissioner Dan Walsh, was the silent partner in this operation. He was the power behind the throne, the man who ensured that any inconvenient regulations were rewritten and any formal complaints to the county mysteriously vanished into a bureaucratic black hole. Together, they ran our peaceful lakeside community like their own personal kingdom, and its residents were simply subjects to be taxed and controlled. Their primary method of plunder was a masterpiece of simple, arrogant fraud. It was a scheme I'd seen a dozen times in my career, just on a smaller scale. It began with a manufactured crisis. Brenda, citing anonymous environmental concerns, would declare an emergency. The most profitable one was the Lakeshore Erosion Remediation Project. Official-looking letters, printed on expensive letterhead featuring the HOA's newly designed corporate-style logo, would arrive at every home. They spoke in dire terms of imminent shoreline collapse and plummeting property values. The solution was always an immediate, non-negotiable emergency assessment, usually $5,000 to $10,000 per household, payable within 30 days. The contractor hired for this vital work was always the same, a company called Walsh Environmental Services. A cursory search, something no one had ever thought to do before, would have revealed that Walsh Environmental was an LLC with no employees, no equipment, and no physical address beyond a P.O. box in the next town over. The owner of record was Brenda's brother-in-law. It was a classic pass-through entity, a shell company designed for one purpose: to launder the assessment fees directly into the Walsh family's pockets. They were stealing from their neighbors in broad daylight, using fear and a thin veneer of legality as their cover. And for 2 years, it worked perfectly. Anyone who questioned the fees or was slow to pay was targeted, harassed, and buried under an avalanche of fines for petty, non-existent violations. Brenda's favorite targets were the elderly, the people who were least likely to fight back. Her most brutal conquest was the destruction of the Peterson family. Arthur and Mary Peterson were in their 80s, and had lived in their small, modest cabin for 40 years. They were quiet, kind people who lived on a fixed pension. They couldn't afford the initial $10,000 assessment. That's when Brenda's campaign of terror began. They were cited for having the wrong shade of white on their window trim, a $500 fine. They were cited for their bird feeder attracting non-native species, a $1,000 fine. They were fined $200 a day for grass that was allegedly a quarter-inch over the new regulation height. Within 6 months, the Petersons were facing over $20,000 in accumulated fines and legal fees. They were broken. Crying in a community meeting, Arthur explained they'd have to sell their home to pay the debts. And just like that, a generous cash offer appeared from an out-of-state development company. The Petersons, exhausted and defeated, took the offer, which was 40% below market value. They packed up 40 years of memories and disappeared. I later traced the purchasing LLC through 3 layers of corporate veils. The final owner was a holding company registered to none other than County Commissioner Dan Walsh. They hadn't just harassed the Petersons, they had systematically engineered their financial ruin to steal their home. This was the true face of Brenda Walsh's authority. She wasn't a neighborhood administrator, she was a predator. And now, this predator had turned her eyes on me. The certified letter I received was her opening salvo. It was a formal citation, imposing a $5,000 fine for my non-compliant dock structure. The letter was a work of fiction, claiming the dock was an unpermitted environmental hazard that was leaching unapproved chemicals into the lake. It was the same playbook she'd used on the Petersons, a sudden, baseless accusation paired with a crippling fine. She was testing me, expecting me to either pay up or buckle under the pressure. She saw my grandfather's dock, a structure that had stood for 70 years, as just another lever to exert her power. The scent of the ink on that paper smelled like arrogance. The carefully chosen legal jargon was designed to intimidate. It was extortion, plain and simple, dressed up in the language of community bylaws. Sitting at my grandfather's oak table, reading the citation for a 3rd time, I didn't feel fear. I didn't even feel anger, not the hot, blinding kind. What I felt was a cold, familiar calm. It was the same feeling I used to get at the DOJ when a new case file landed on my desk. It was the feeling of seeing the crime laid out in plain sight, of recognizing the pattern, the signature of the criminal. Brenda Walsh had just used the exact same tactics on me that she had used to destroy a dozen other families. She thought I was just another old man she could bleed dry and discard. She had just made the final, fatal mistake of her criminal career. She had made herself my case. Most people, when faced with a $5,000 fine and a threat from a corrupt HOA, would call a lawyer. I didn't. Lawyers are for defense. I was on offense. I walked into my small home office, powered up my computer, and created a new encrypted folder on my hard drive. I labeled it Walsh, Brenda et al., Financial Crimes Division. Then I went to work. For 30 years, my job began not with interviews or witnesses, but with a deep dive into the digital and paper trails that criminals always, inevitably, leave behind. Brenda Walsh was an amateur, and amateurs are sloppy. My first stop was the online portal for the Secretary of State's business registry. I typed in Walsh Environmental Services. The record popped up in less than a second. Just as I suspected, it was an LLC formed 2 years ago, exactly 1 month after Brenda seized control of the HOA. The registered agent was a man named Kevin Muller. Brenda's maiden name was Muller. A quick public records search confirmed Kevin was her brother-in-law, a man whose last known employment was a part-time job stocking shelves at a grocery store. The official business address was a P.O. box. In my world, these are called red flags. To me, they were screaming confessions. Next, I needed to see the HOA's books. Legally, as a homeowner, I had the right to review them. But I knew Brenda would stonewall me, burying me in procedural delays. I needed a faster way in. I remembered a quiet man named George Henderson, a retired accountant who had served as the HOA treasurer for 15 years before Brenda had him pushed out. I found him tending his garden. When I explained that I was looking into the emergency assessments, his face hardened. "She bankrupted this association," he said, his voice a low growl. "Refused to let the finance committee see the contracts or the invoices. It's all a black box." That evening, a thick manila envelope appeared on my doorstep. It contained the last 2 years of the HOA's complete bank statements. George had kept his own copies. With the bank records, I could finally do what I do best. I poured a cup of black coffee, opened my forensic accounting software, and began to map the flow of money. It was a bloodbath. I saw the massive influx of cash every time an emergency assessment was levied. Then, within days, I saw the corresponding outflows, huge round-number wire transfers to Walsh Environmental Services. $50,000 here, $75,000 there. In 30 years at the DOJ, I never saw a legitimate contractor bill in round numbers. Legitimate work has expenses, materials, labor. It comes out to specific, itemized amounts. Round numbers are the sign of a bribe, a kickback, or, in this case, pure, unfiltered theft. The wire transfers constituted a clear pattern of federal wire fraud. Each one was a separate felony count. But the embezzlement was just the symptom. I needed to find the disease, the underlying motive. Harassing residents for money was one thing, but the relentless, vicious campaign against the Petersons, and now the immediate, aggressive attack on me, it felt too personal. There had to be a reason my property, specifically, was a target. My grandfather's words about my deed echoed in my head. The conservation easement, the riparian rights, my property was unique. Why did that matter to them? The answer, I knew, wouldn't be in the HOA's books. It would be buried in her husband's. I shifted my investigation from the HOA to the county commissioner's office. I spent the next 2 days combing through the county's online database of planning board minutes, zoning variance applications, and proposed development projects. It was tedious, mind-numbing work, but on page 217 of a 400-page quarterly planning report, I found it. It was a preliminary proposal for a $50 million luxury condominium development called the Clearwater Residences, slated for the undeveloped woodlands directly behind my property. The developer was a faceless corporation out of Chicago, but the local sponsor and champion of the project was listed as County Commissioner Dan Walsh. He was pushing it hard, citing the tremendous tax revenue it would bring to the community. I downloaded the full development proposal, a massive file containing blueprints, environmental impact studies, and logistical plans. And then, buried deep in Appendix C, Section 4, under Utility and Access Easements, I found the map that explained everything. The proposed development was landlocked. To be profitable, it needed a primary access road for construction and residential traffic, and a direct line for running water, sewer, and power from the main road. The most direct, and by far the cheapest route for that road and utility corridor ran directly through the southern edge of one single property. Mine. Specifically, it cut straight through the 30 acres protected by my state conservation easement. The document stated that acquiring this easement was critical to project viability. Without my land, their entire $50 million deal would be dead in the water, a financial impossibility. Everything clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. The harassment, the fines, the escalating pressure. It wasn't just about stealing HOA fees. That was just a side hustle. The main goal was to force me out, to harass me, bleed me dry with fines, and break my will until I was forced to sell my land, just like the Petersons. They needed my legacy, my grandfather's protected sanctuary, to pave it over for their golden goose. The citation for my doc wasn't a random act of tyranny. It was the first step in a calculated campaign to declare me a problem resident, to build a paper trail that would justify further, more aggressive action. They were planning to steal my home, and they were using the HOA as the blunt instrument to do it. I leaned back in my chair, the glow of the monitor illuminating the stacks of evidence I'd compiled. The picture was now complete. I had the bank statements proving the wire fraud. I had the corporate documents for the shell company. I had the public records showing the conflict of interest with the county commissioner. And now I had the motive. A $50 million conspiracy to commit development fraud, predicated on illegally seizing my land. Brenda Walsh thought she was sending me a $5,000 fine to intimidate an old man. What she had actually done was hand-deliver the complete, unredacted roadmap to her own destruction. And I was about to follow that map all the way to a federal courtroom. The investigation phase was over. It was time to begin the prosecution. With a complete case file sitting on my hard drive, my first move wasn't to the authorities. It was to rattle the cage. A premature move could spook them, give them time to shred documents and hide assets. I needed them to escalate. I needed more evidence of their criminal intent, and I knew just how to get it. I made a call to an old colleague from the DOJ, a man named Ben Carter, who was now in private practice. I didn't need a bulldog. I needed a surgeon. The letter he drafted and sent to the HOA Board of Directors was a masterpiece of understated menace. It didn't make accusations. It simply formally requested the preservation of all financial documents, contracts, and communications related to Walsh Environmental Services, pending a shareholder review. It also included a polite inquiry as to why the HOA's mandatory Form 990 tax returns were 2 years delinquent, citing the specific IRS statute that exposed them to federal penalties. It was a professional shot across the bow, a clear signal to anyone with a brain that a real investigation was coming. The letter had its intended effect. It triggered absolute panic. A reasonable person faced with such a letter would have hired a lawyer and prepared for a negotiation. But Brenda Walsh wasn't reasonable. She was a cornered predator, and her only instinct was to attack. The day after the letter was received, the war of harassment began in earnest. Her husband, Commissioner Walsh, unleashed the full force of the county bureaucracy against me, intending to bury me in violations and prove I was an unfit homeowner. It was a classic abuse of power, and it was beautifully clumsy. The first to arrive was the county building inspector, a man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He had an order, signed by Walsh, to conduct a full structural survey due to anonymous safety complaints. For 4 hours, he crawled through my grandfather's 70-year-old cabin. He expected to find crumbling foundations and faulty wiring. Instead, he found hand-hewn beams as solid as iron and stonework that would survive a hurricane. As he was leaving, he shook his head. "I don't know who you pissed off, Mr. Miller," he muttered, "but this place is built better than any of the new condos on the lake. The report will say you exceed every modern code." That was strike one for Brenda. 2 days later, the health department showed up. Another anonymous tip about a failing septic system poisoning the lake. The inspector, a young woman who looked barely out of college, conducted a full dye test. The results were perfect. My off-grid system, which my grandfather had engineered with painstaking precision, was a model of environmental efficiency. "There's nothing wrong here," she said, clearly annoyed at the wasted trip. "Your system is cleaner than most of the municipal lines." Strike two. The fire marshal followed, sent to investigate a complaint about my unpermitted and hazardous fieldstone fireplace. He took one look at the flue, the triple-lined insulation, and the solid masonry construction, and almost laughed. "Hazardous?" he said. "I wish every fireplace in this county was built to this standard." Strike 3. Each visit was an inconvenience, but it was also a gift. Each inspector filed an official report clearing my property, creating a government-stamped paper trail that proved the Walsh's harassment campaign was based on malicious lies. They were unwittingly building my case for me. While the official attacks failed, Brenda opened a new front in the war: social media. In the private HOA Facebook group, she began a campaign of masterful propaganda. She never mentioned me by name, but everyone knew who she was talking about. She posted concerned warnings about certain properties that refused to comply with vital safety inspections. She shared articles about collapsing septic systems and the dangers of old wiring, hinting that one resident's stubborn refusal to modernize was putting the entire community's health and property values at risk. The comments section became a cesspool of fear and paranoia. Neighbors who once waved to me now looked away. People I'd known for years were liking posts that painted me as a reckless menace. She was isolating me, turning the community against me, a classic tactic of psychological warfare. Her confidence buoyed by her online lynch mob, Brenda decided it was time for the kill shot. She sent out a notice for a mandatory emergency HOA meeting. The sole agenda item: to discuss enforcement actions against the non-compliant resident of Lot 12 and to authorize a legal lien against the property. She was planning to use the public forum to humiliate me, to cement her narrative, and to get the community's official blessing to escalate her legal attacks. She thought she was setting a trap for me. In reality, she was building my stage. The night of the meeting, the community hall was packed. The air was thick with tension. Brenda stood at a podium at the front, flanked by two of her board member cronies. She looked confident, powerful. She had the home field advantage. I sat in the back row, my file of evidence tucked into a simple leather briefcase on my lap. Brenda delivered a soaring, sanctimonious speech about the importance of rules, of community, of protecting their shared investment. She painted a picture of a single selfish homeowner whose obstinacy threatened to undo all of her hard work. She spoke of safety, of property values, of the law. It was a masterful performance. Then she turned her eyes to me. "The resident of Lot 12 is here tonight," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. Perhaps he'd like to explain to his neighbors why he believes he is above the rules that govern the rest of us. Every head in the room turned to me. This was the moment she had engineered. The public shaming. I stood up, picked up my briefcase, and walked slowly to the front of the room. I didn't go to the podium. I stood in the center of the floor so I could address the residents as my peers. The room was dead silent. I could feel Brenda's smug glare burning into me. "My name is Frank Miller," I began, my voice calm and even. "My family has owned Lot 12 for 70 years. I'm not going to talk about my dock, or my septic system, or my fireplace. I'm going to talk about your money." A murmur went through the crowd. 2 years ago, you all paid a $10,000 emergency assessment for a so-called erosion remediation project. That's over $1 million. I'd like to ask the board to produce the engineering reports for this project, the competitive bids from contractors, and the final inspection report from the county. Brenda's face tightened. "That is confidential HOA business," she snapped. "It's public record, actually," I said, my voice never rising. "Or it would be if the project was real. The contractor you paid, Walsh Environmental Services, is a shell company owned by your brother-in-law, Brenda. It has no employees and no equipment. You didn't pay for erosion control. You paid for the Walsh's new boat and a luxury vacation to Europe." The room erupted in gasps and angry whispers. "And the reason you're being targeted, Frank," I said, turning to my neighbors, "is because your land is in the way of a $50 million development deal that Commissioner Dan Walsh is trying to push through the county, a deal that is only profitable if they can seize his property." "This is slander!" Brenda shrieked, her composure finally shattering. "You are a liar. I will sue you for everything you have." She pointed a trembling finger at me, her face contorted in a mask of rage. I let her rant, let everyone in the room see the tyrant behind the mask. When she finally paused to take a breath, I turned to face her directly. I let the silence hang in the air for a beat. And then, I delivered the final blow. I let my voice drop into the calm, measured tone I used to use in federal depositions. "For 30 years, Brenda," I said, making sure to lock her eyes, "my job at the Department of Justice was to build federal racketeering cases against criminals who used shell companies, political influence, and intimidation to defraud communities. The pattern of financial transactions, the shell corporation, the kickbacks to a public official, and the coordinated harassment to seize property for development. It isn't just a violation of HOA bylaws. It's a textbook violation of the Federal Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the RICO Act." I paused again, letting the weight of that word, RICO, settle over the room. "You are not dealing with a retired fisherman. You are dealing with the man who is personally compiling the federal case against you and your husband." "This meeting," I said, gesturing to the shocked faces around me, "is over. My next meeting is with the State Attorney General." I turned and walked back to my seat without another word. The look on Brenda's face wasn't anger anymore. It was pure, abject fear. The kind of fear a predator feels when it realizes, far too late, that it has been hunting something much, much higher on the food chain. She thought I was making a threat. I wasn't. I was stating a professional fact. My investigation was complete. The only thing left was the prosecution. The morning after the HOA meeting, the silence in our community was louder than any of Brenda's shouting had ever been. The private Facebook group she had used as her weapon was deleted. The usual parade of landscaping trucks flying the Walsh Environmental logo was nowhere to be seen. Neighbors who had been avoiding my gaze for months were suddenly stopping by my porch, offering quiet words of support, their faces a mixture of shock and relief. Brenda Walsh's reign of terror had been built on a carefully crafted illusion of power, and in one 5-minute speech, I had shattered it. But exposing a criminal isn't the same as convicting one. The public humiliation was just the opening salvo. Now, it was time to bring in the professionals. I spent the next morning in my office, not celebrating, but working. I took the digital case file I had built, every fraudulent invoice, every bank statement, every property deed, every timeline of harassment, and organized it into 3 identical, meticulously indexed binders. Each binder was over 300 pages long. It was a prosecution-ready package, the kind of airtight case file I used to hand over to federal attorneys. Most people hire lawyers to fight these battles. I just called my old colleagues. My attack would be a 3-pronged assault, aimed at the 3 pillars of their criminal enterprise: their money, their political power, and their freedom. The first binder went into a FedEx box, addressed to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service in Washington, D.C. With it, I filed an official whistleblower complaint. I didn't just accuse them of tax fraud. I laid out the evidence showing the HOA was operating as a fraudulent nonprofit, that Walsh Environmental was a pass-through entity for embezzled funds, and that Brenda and her husband had failed to declare hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal income. I knew from experience that nothing gets the federal government's attention faster than a detailed map showing them where to find untaxed money. That package was aimed directly at their wallet. The second binder was for the FBI. I didn't call a generic tip line. I called the direct line of a man named John Riley, the special agent in charge of the regional FBI field office. I had been John's mentor at the DOJ 20 years ago. "Frank," he said, his voice surprised, "I thought you were spending your days chasing fish." "I am, John," I replied. "I just happened to catch a couple of sharks. I have a gift for you, a complete, self-contained RICO case, public corruption, wire fraud, conspiracy, the works. It's all in the package I just messengered to your office. The targets are a county commissioner named Dan Walsh and his wife, Brenda." There was a pause on the line, and then a low whistle. "Understood, Frank," he said, his voice all business now. "We'll take it from here." That call was aimed at their political cover. The third binder was for the state. I called the main office of the state attorney general and asked for the head of the Public Integrity Unit. I introduced myself by my name and my old DOJ title. I gave him a concise 3-minute summary of the entire scheme. He was silent for a moment. "Mr. Miller," he said finally, "your reputation precedes you. When would you be available to provide us with a formal briefing?" That call was aimed squarely at their freedom. The effect of this coordinated attack was not immediate, but it was decisive. The dominoes began to fall, slowly at first, and then with breathtaking speed. A week after my calls, 2 quiet, professional-looking investigators from the Attorney General's office walked into the county administration building and served Commissioner Dan Walsh with a subpoena for all of his financial records and communications. The news ripped through the local political scene. Walsh, the untouchable power broker, was suddenly toxic. His allies in the county government began to distance themselves. His political shield was gone. The next domino was the HOA's money. 2 weeks after the meeting, the HOA's bank accounts were frozen by the IRS. A notice was posted on the community clubhouse door announcing a full forensic audit, pending a federal investigation. Brenda's financial pipeline was severed. The landscaping withered. The security gate at the entrance broke and wasn't repaired. The entire facade of her upscale resort community began to literally crumble. At the same time, the FBI began quietly interviewing residents. They started with the Petersons, who gave a tearful 4-hour deposition detailing the campaign of harassment that had cost them their home. Soon, a dozen other families who had been fined or intimidated came forward, emboldened by the news that the Walshes were finally being held accountable. Brenda was completely isolated. Her husband was consumed by his own spiraling legal catastrophe. Her board member cronies had all resigned, claiming they had been misled. The neighbors she had ruled through fear now looked at her with open contempt. She became a ghost in her own community, seen only through the windows of her McMansion, her face pale and drawn. She was a queen without a kingdom, a bully without anyone left to intimidate. A rational person would have hired the best defense attorney they could find and prepared for the inevitable. But Brenda wasn't rational. She was a narcissist, and narcissists believe they can control any narrative. She saw herself as a victim, a martyr being persecuted by a corrupt system. A month later, I received the call I was waiting for. It wasn't an investigator or a prosecutor. It was from the personal assistant of Attorney General Catherine Royce herself. "Mr. Miller," the assistant said, "the Attorney General has reviewed your file. She calls it one of the most well-documented cases of public corruption she's ever seen. She would like to meet with you personally to discuss the final stages of the indictment. For security and privacy, she has suggested the meeting take place at your residence." The trap was now set. The final piece was in motion. Brenda was cornered, broke, and abandoned. Her entire world had been systematically dismantled. And when her few remaining sources in the county courthouse whispered to her that a black, government-owned sedan carrying the state attorney general was heading down the private road to my cabin, she decided to make one last, desperate, and gloriously stupid move. The morning Attorney General Catherine Royce arrived at my cabin. The lake was perfectly still. She was just as I had seen her on the news, sharp, professional, and with an air of absolute, unshakable authority. We sat at my grandfather's table, her briefcase open next to my evidence binders. "Frank," she said, her voice holding a note of professional respect, "this is the most complete, self-contained case of public corruption I have ever seen from a private citizen. You've handed us a half-dozen federal indictments on a silver platter. We're ready to unseal them next week. We were discussing the final legal mechanics when we heard it. The enraged roar of a V8 engine tearing up my gravel driveway. It was Brenda's pearl-white Escalade, driving with a suicidal recklessness that told me her sanity had finally snapped. "Is this who I think it is?" the Attorney General asked, not with alarm, but with a flicker of grim satisfaction. "She's predictable," I replied. Then came the crash. The sound of my front door exploding inward filled the small cabin. Brenda stood there, wild-eyed and triumphant, her phone held high like a holy symbol, live-streaming her final fatal mistake to the world. Her shrieking tirade about conspiracies and harassment filled the air. I just sat there, watching the scene unfold exactly as I knew it would. I watched as her brain failed to process the reality of the calm, well-dressed woman sitting at my table. I watched as the Attorney General of the state of 100 stood, presented her badge, and lowered the boom. "Mrs. Walsh," she said, her voice cutting through Brenda's rant like a razor, "you are under arrest." The look on Brenda's face, broadcast live to her few remaining followers, was a Picasso of shattered arrogance and pure terror. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Her phone was still streaming as two plain-clothed state troopers, the AG's security detail, stepped through the ruined doorway. They were followed moments later by two FBI agents, including my old protege, John Riley, who had clearly been waiting nearby. The clicking of the handcuffs as they snapped around Brenda's wrists was the punctuation mark on her entire pathetic reign. Her phone clattered to the floor, the screen showing a torrent of confused and horrified comments from the same people who had been cheering her on moments before. As they led her away, stumbling past the dock she tried to steal, she finally found her voice, screaming, "You don't know who you're dealing with! My husband will end you. In fact, we did know. We were dealing with a common criminal, and as for her husband, the FBI was already at the county courthouse, arresting him in the middle of a commissioners' meeting." 3 months later, I sat in a federal courtroom and watched justice get delivered. Brenda Walsh, stripped of her designer clothes and her arrogance, was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison for wire fraud, conspiracy, and extortion. Her husband, Dan Walsh, received 3 years for conspiracy and abuse of public office. The shell company was dissolved, and every last dollar they had stolen was seized. The HOA was placed into state receivership, its bylaws rewritten to ensure transparency and prevent any one person from ever accumulating that kind of power again. But the greatest victory was for the people she had harmed. Using the seized assets, the state created a restitution fund. The first check went to Arthur and Mary Peterson. It wasn't just for the amount they'd been forced to sell their home for. It was for the full fair market value, plus punitive damages for the emotional distress they had endured. I heard they bought a small house just down the road from their grandchildren. Other families who had been extorted and fined received checks as well. Every penny Brenda had stolen returned with interest. The community began to heal. The fear she had cultivated was replaced by a renewed sense of cooperation and neighborliness. My work wasn't quite done. The Attorney General's office asked me to consult on a new piece of state legislation. I spent a month working with her staff, using my 30 years of experience to help them draft a law that would protect homeowners from predators like Brenda. The Homeowner Financial Protection Act, as it came to be called, mandated annual independent forensic audits for any HOA managing over $100,000 in assets. It created new felony charges for HOA-related fraud and gave the state AG's office expanded power to investigate. My grandfather had built a fortress of law around his own land. I had simply helped extend that protection to the entire state. I'm sitting on his dock right now, watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of orange and purple. The water is calm. The only sounds are the call of the loons and the gentle lap of waves against the old wood. The silence I came here for has finally returned. Brenda Walsh learned the hard way that you should never, ever try to outsmart a man who spent his life catching criminals far smarter than you. She saw an old man in a cabin. She should have seen the 30 years of federal justice standing behind him. Now, I want to hear your story. If you've ever had to fight one of these HOA tyrants, drop a comment below and tell us about it. Your story needs to be heard. You are not alone in this fight. If this story gave you a sense of justice, smash that like button. And make sure you hit subscribe, because this is what we do here. We tell the stories of everyday people who refused to back down. Join us next week, when I'll tell you about the corrupt city inspector who tried to condemn a disabled veteran's family home, right up until he found out the vet's brother was a federal judge. You don't want to miss it.